Welcome to Warhammer 40,000 Lore to Sleep To. Today we'll be exploring the origins and other details of Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels Legiones Astartes. So lie back, relax, and let's begin. Myth and legend. In the long and storied history of the Imperium of man, few figures have left an impression as deep and as enduring as Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels. He stands apart from his brothers, not merely as a warrior, or a general, or a ruler, but as something closer to an ideal. A living testament to what humanity, at its very finest, might one day become. Among the 20 Primarchs created by the Emperor of Mankind, each was extraordinary. Each was a being of impossible power and towering intellect, shaped to lead armies and forge civilizations. And yet, even among those demigods, Sanguinius occupied a place all his own. He was the most revered. Not through conquest alone, nor through the cold exercise of authority, but through the simple, overwhelming force of his presence. To stand before him was, by all accounts, to feel something stir within the soul. Something ancient and aching, like the memory of a world without suffering. He was nobility made flesh, and his story, like all the greatest of stories, is threaded through with tragedy. For the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow it casts. And Sanguinius burned more brilliantly than almost any other. He was known by many names across the 10,000 years of imperial history, but two titles clung to him above all others, passed down through generations of warriors and scholars and grieving faithful alike. The Great Angel, the Brightest One. These were not titles bestowed by decree or carved into stone by bureaucratic hands. They were names that arose organically, born from the lips of those who had seen him, or fought beside him, or simply heard tell of him across the vast and lightless reaches of the galaxy. The Great Angel spoke to his appearance, to those tremendous wings that spread from his shoulders like a blessing made physical, but it spoke to something deeper as well. An angelic quality that went beyond the visual, beyond the merely aesthetic. There was a grace to Sanguinius, a gentleness threaded through even his most ferocious moments in battle, that set him apart. And the Brightest One carried with it a different kind of weight. It suggested not merely beauty, but illumination. The idea that wherever he went, darkness retreated a little. That hope, that most fragile and precious of human feelings, burned a little more steadily in his vicinity. Both titles survive him still, spoken with a reverence that borders on the sacred, long after the man himself has passed beyond the veil. To speak of Sanguinius without speaking of his appearance would be to leave the portrait unfinished. He was, by every account that survives, breathtaking to behold. Tall even by the standards of the Primarchs, with features of such symmetrical and luminous beauty that those who encountered him for the first time often found themselves momentarily speechless. His hair fell in waves of deep gold, and his eyes held a quality that observers struggled to articulate. Warm and ancient and unutterably sad, all at once. But it was his wings that drew the eye, and held it. Great feathered wings, broad and powerful, white as fresh snow in the upper atmosphere, capable of carrying him aloft with an effortless sweeping grace that seemed to belong more to dream than to reality. In the heat of battle, with those wings spread wide and his golden armor catching the light of burning worlds, he must have appeared less like a man and more like something from the oldest myths of humanity, an avenging spirit, a guardian made manifest. And yet those who knew him well would say that it was not the wings that defined him, nor the face, nor the armor. It was the quiet warmth in his expression. The way he looked at you as though you mattered. As though every soul in his presence was to him, precious and irreplaceable. There is a question that has occupied theologians, historians, and warriors of the Imperium for 10,000 years, whispered in the candlelit halls of monasteries and debated in the hushed archives of the Administratum. Of all the Primarchs, those 20 magnificent sons of the Emperor, each a facet of his vast and unknowable mind, which one came closest to reflecting the soul of their father? It is not a question with a clean answer. Each Primarch embodied something essential: courage, intellect, compassion, determination. But when the question is asked, one name rises to the surface with a quiet and persistent frequency: Sanguinius. Not because he was the most powerful, though he was formidable beyond measure. Not because he was the most obedient, or the most strategically gifted, or the most feared. But because of something less tangible and more profound. A quality of spirit. An orientation toward beauty and mercy, and sacrifice that seemed, to those who observed them both, to mirror something in the Emperor himself. Some deeply buried tenderness, some anguished love for the species he had given everything to protect. If the Emperor dreamed of what humanity could be at its most radiant, then Sanguinius was the closest that dream ever came to walking the earth. And that, perhaps, is why his loss was felt so differently from all the others. He is gone. He has been gone for 10,000 years, his death a wound in the history of the Imperium that has never truly healed, memorialized in ritual and mourning and the solemn annual observances of his sons. And yet, in a very real sense, Sanguinius has never left. His legacy persists not merely in the Blood Angels and their successor chapters, who carry his gene seed and his memory with them into every battle. It persists in the broader culture of the Imperium itself, in the art and the iconography and the quietly desperate faith of billions of ordinary human beings who have never held a bolter or set foot aboard a warship. In the darkest corners of the galaxy, on worlds where the night seems permanent and the forces of chaos press close at every wall, it is not uncommon to find his image. Painted on the walls of shelters. Scratched into the armor of soldiers. Whispered in prayers that the official creed might not even fully recognize. He has become, across the long millennia, something the Imperium desperately needs and so rarely finds: a symbol of hope. Not the cold grinding functional hope of survival, but the warm, luminous, almost irrational hope that things could be beautiful. That sacrifice could be meaningful. That the light, even now, has not entirely gone out. Birth and strange origins. Before there were Space Marines, before there were chapters or legions or the 10,000 warrior brotherhoods that would come to define the military might of the Imperium, there was a single, extraordinary act of creation. Deep within the most secure and secret laboratories of terror, the Emperor of Mankind, a being of such immense psychic power and intellectual reach that the word human sits only loosely upon him, undertook a project of breathtaking ambition. He would create sons. Not children in any ordinary sense, but beings of engineered perfection, each one a distillation of some aspect of his own vast and complex nature. There would be 20 of them. 20 Primarchs, each one a demigod in their own right, possessed of superhuman strength and speed and intellect, and each one intended to serve as the supreme commander of a Space Marine Legion in the Great Crusade to reunite the scattered remnants of humanity beneath a single banner. The project was without precedent. It was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable things ever attempted in the long and turbulent history of our species. And it very nearly went perfectly. But the forces of chaos, ever watchful, ever hungry, reached into the Emperor's work before it was complete, and scattered the 20 infant Primarchs across the galaxy, each one lost to the void, each one falling toward a different world and a different fate. Each of the 20 Primarchs was extraordinary. Each defied easy categorization, possessed of abilities and qualities that went far beyond what even the most optimistic reading of human potential might suggest. But they were, in their physical forms, recognizably the products of their father's design. Immense, powerful, and essentially humanoid. All of them, that is, except one. Sanguinius arrived in the world bearing something none of his brothers carried. Something that could not be explained away as mere enhancement or engineered superiority. From his shoulders grew wings. Great, feathered, functional wings, white and broad, and undeniably, unmistakably real. They were not vestigial. They were not decorative. They bore him aloft with ease, caught the thermals of alien skies, and carried him across battlefields with a speed and freedom that even his brothers could not match in open air. Among all the Primarchs, those 20 pinnacles of imperial genetic science, he alone bore a visible physical deviation from the human template. In the cold and clinical language of the Imperium's own doctrine, a mutation. And in an institution that regards mutation with deep suspicion, bordering frequently on outright horror, this was a fact of no small significance. It set him apart from the very beginning. It made him unique in ways that went beyond the merely visual, raising questions about the nature of his creation that even the Emperor's own scholars struggled to fully answer. It is a remarkable and rather telling detail that even the Emperor of mankind, that towering nigh-omniscient figure who had designed each of his sons with meticulous and loving care, looked upon the wings of Sanguinius and felt, at first, something like unease. The wings were unplanned. They were not part of the original design, not a feature the Emperor had intended to bestow. They were, in the strictest sense, a deviation, a sign that something beyond his control had touched his work and left its mark. And so, in those earliest moments of reunion, when father met son for the first time and took the measure of what had grown from his carefully laid genetic foundations, there was hesitation. A flicker of doubt. The wings were a flaw, or so it seemed. A reminder that the great project of the Primarchs had not been entirely his own, that other hands, invisible, malicious, had reached into it. But that uncertainty did not last. It could not last, in the face of what Sanguinius was. Because the wings, it turned out, were not a corruption. They were not a mark of something lesser. They were, if anything, an enhancement, not merely physical, but symbolic. They transformed an already extraordinary being into something that looked, to all who beheld him, unmistakably divine. And the Emperor, wise enough to recognize beauty even where he had not intended it, came in time to see them not as a flaw, but as a mark of the most singular nobility. Every Space Marine Legion traces its identity back to a single source, the gene seed of its Primarch. It is from this biological foundation that the long and grueling process of creating a Space Marine begins, the genetic material of the Primarch replicated and implanted, and coaxed into transforming an ordinary human being into something far beyond ordinary. The gene seed is, in a very real sense, the soul of a legion, the thread of identity that binds 10,000 warriors across centuries and star systems into a single, coherent brotherhood. And the gene seed of Sanguinius was, like the man himself, extraordinary. It carried within it the echoes of his beauty and his strength and his grace. It carried, too, the seeds of something more troubling, a darkness buried deep in the genetic material, a flaw that would not fully reveal itself until long after he was gone. But in those earliest days, as the legion that would become the Blood Angels began to take shape around the figure of their golden Primarch, there was little thought of darkness. There was only pride and wonder, and the quiet, overwhelming gratitude of warriors who had been given the greatest gift imaginable. Not merely the strength of their father, but something of his spirit as well. To carry the blood of Sanguinius was, from the very beginning, understood to be something rare and precious. Something that demanded to be honored. Baal, the harsh beginning. Not all origins are gentle. Not all beginnings are bathed in light. The world upon which Sanguinius came to rest, after the great scattering that tore the infant Primarchs from the Emperor's side and flung them across the uncaring void, was not a world of beauty or abundance. It was a world of ruin. Baal, and its two moons, Baal Primus and Baal Secundus, the latter of which became his home, was a place that had once, in some distant and half-forgotten age, been something else entirely. Fertile, perhaps. Livable, certainly. But that time was long past. What remained was a landscape of breathtaking desolation, scoured by radiation and baked beneath a merciless sun, its surface a vast and broken wilderness of dust and rock and the skeletal remnants of structures that had crumbled long before any living memory. The atmosphere itself was hostile, heavy with the invisible damage wrought by centuries of radioactive contamination, and the life that persisted there did so only through extraordinary adaptation or extraordinary stubbornness, and often both. It was onto this harsh and unforgiving stage that the infant Sanguinius fell. Alone, as all the Primarchs were alone in those first moments. Surrounded by a world that offered nothing easily, that demanded everything in return for the barest foothold of survival. It was not the beginning that a being of his nature might seem to deserve, but perhaps it was exactly the beginning he needed. The people of Baal Secundus were not, by any conventional measure, welcoming. They could not afford to be. Survival on that blasted and irradiated moon required a hardness of spirit that left little room for warmth, and the generations of radiation exposure had left their mark on the human population in ways that made trust a rare and fragile commodity. Mutation was everywhere on Baal Secundus, in the twisted limbs of the desperate and the dying, in the grotesque adaptations that allowed some bloodlines to persist where others had long since perished. And the tribes that wandered its wastes had learned, through bitter experience, to regard the unfamiliar with fear, and fear with hostility. Into this world came a child unlike anything they had ever seen. A child of impossible physical perfection in a place defined by imperfection. A child with wings, white and pristine, against the dusty ruin of the landscape, whose beauty was so profound and so utterly at odds with everything around him that it provoked not immediate adoration, but something closer to terror. He was different in ways they could not explain and did not trust. And difference, on Baal Secundus, had a way of getting things killed. The tribes feared him, and their fear expressed itself in the way that fear so often does among desperate peoples, in avoidance, in hostility, and in the cold and watchful suspicion of those who cannot decide whether what stands before them is a miracle or a threat. But fear, it turns out, is not so very far from awe. And awe, given time and the right conditions, has a way of curdling into reverence. The nomadic peoples of Baal Secundus lived close to the mythological. In a world where survival was never guaranteed and the forces of the environment felt personal and punishing, the line between the natural and the supernatural was thin and frequently crossed. They had their gods, as all desperate peoples do, figures of fire and sky and endurance, worshipped not with comfortable faith but with the raw, urgent devotion of those who believe, genuinely and viscerally, that without divine favor they will simply not survive the next season. And then there was Sanguinius. A being of luminous beauty, descended from the sky, bearing wings like the creatures of their oldest stories, touched by a radiance that seemed almost literal in the harsh flat light of Baal Secundus. It was perhaps inevitable that they would reach for their mythology to make sense of him. A sun god, they called him, or something to that effect, in the shifting dialects of the wasteland tribes. A divine being, sent from above, touched by powers beyond mortal comprehension. The worship was not always comfortable for the tribes that practiced it. It sat alongside their fear rather than replacing it. But it gave them a framework, a way of orienting themselves around a presence that otherwise defied all categorization. Worship, however fervent, is not the same as acceptance. And Sanguinius, even as a child, even before the full scope of his abilities had made itself known, seemed to understand this distinction intuitively. He did not wish to be a god to these people. He wished to be among them. To belong somewhere, as all living creatures, however extraordinary, feel the pull to belong. And so he did what Primarchs do, in one form or another, on all the strange and difficult worlds where fate deposits them. He proved himself. Not through declaration or the simple overwhelming force of his presence, though both would have been available to him, but through action. Through the quiet, consistent demonstration of what he was capable of, in the protection of the weak, in the facing down of the manifold dangers that Baal Secundus placed in the path of its inhabitants, in the leadership of hunts and the organization of defenses and the slow, patient work of making life a little more sustainable for the people around him. Strength they respected, because strength was the currency of survival on that moon. But it was his leadership that truly won them, the way he led not from a position of superiority, but from the front, alongside them, sharing the hardship and asking for nothing beyond the chance to be useful. Acceptance, when it came, was hard-won and genuine. And that, in its own way, was worth more than any amount of worship. The first signs of darkness. There is a cruelty in knowing. In being given, before you have the language or the experience to process it, a glimpse of something terrible that waits for you at the end of a long and winding road. Most beings are spared this. Most move through their lives in the merciful ignorance of the present moment, unable to see what is coming, protected by the simple limitation of being only human. Sanguinius was not afforded that protection. At the age of 1, an age at which even a Primarch is still in the earliest stages of his extraordinary development, he was visited by something that no infant mind should ever have to contain. A vision. Overwhelming, total, and devastating in its clarity. It came without warning and without mercy, as true visions so often do, seizing him in its grip and filling his waking mind with images of violence and despair so profound that those who witnessed him in the grip of it were struck with horror. What he saw, in that first terrible visitation, was something that would come to be known, in the long and sorrowful history of his legion, as the Black Rage. A darkness at the heart of his own bloodline. A wound in the soul of every warrior who would ever carry his gene seed. He could not have understood it then. But he felt it, and the feeling never entirely left him. From that moment forward, some small part of Sanguinius carried a shadow that all his radiance could never quite dispel. Baal Secundus did not offer its inhabitants the luxury of a prolonged or peaceful childhood, and Sanguinius, for all his divine aspect and the reverent distance the tribes maintained around him, was no exception to the brutal rhythms of life on that irradiated moon. The wasteland was full of dangers. Mutated creatures of considerable size and ferocity, warped by generations of radiation into forms that bore only a passing resemblance to whatever they had once been, and possessed of an aggression that made every journey across open ground a potential confrontation with death. It was in this context that Sanguinius, still a child by any reasonable measure, faced one of these creatures and did not flinch. The accounts that survive are fragmentary and colored by the reverence of those who recorded them, but the shape of the story is consistent. A creature of enormous size, a mutant beast of the kind that made even the hardened wasteland warriors of Baal Secundus wary, was met, and was killed, by a child with wings who had not yet grown into the full measure of his strength. The feat was remarkable not merely as a demonstration of physical capability, though it was certainly that. It was remarkable for what it revealed about his character. There was no hesitation in him. No paralysis in the face of something vast and terrifying. Only a clear-eyed, focused stillness, and then action, swift and decisive and utterly without doubt. Among the many gifts that the Emperor wove into the being of Sanguinius, the strength, the speed, the beauty, the grace, there was one that sat apart from all the others. One that was less a gift than a burden, wrapped in the appearance of a gift. He could see, sometimes, what had not yet happened. Glimpses of the future arrived unbidden, flickering at the edges of his consciousness like candlelight through a crack in a wall. Fragmentary, not always legible, but undeniably real. Precognition is not uncommon among the most powerful psykers of the Imperium, but in Sanguinius it manifested with a particular and poignant quality. His visions were not abstract or symbolic in the way that prophetic dreams so often are. They were vivid and specific, and laden with emotional weight, arriving with the force of memory rather than premonition, as though he were not seeing the future, but remembering it. The effect was disorienting, and sometimes deeply distressing. To know what is coming and be unable to stop it, is one of the more refined forms of suffering available to a conscious being. And as those early visions accumulated, as the shape of what awaited him began, slowly and inexorably, to resolve itself out of the fog of the possible, it became clear that the future Sanguinius was being shown was not a comfortable one. He carried it with characteristic grace. But he carried it nonetheless, every single day. Look closely enough at anything perfect, and you will find the crack. This is not pessimism, it is simply the nature of things, in a universe where nothing exists without cost, and nothing is given without something being taken in return. Sanguinius appeared, to all outward observation, to be as close to perfection as a living being could come. His form was flawless, his character radiant, his capabilities extraordinary even by the standards of his remarkable brothers. And yet, for those who were paying close attention, for those who watched him in the quiet moments, who noticed the way his gaze sometimes went somewhere else entirely, who felt the almost imperceptible tremor in his stillness after the visions came, there was a question that could not quite be silenced. What is the cost of this? Because in the Imperium, as in all things, there is always a cost. The darkness that lived in Sanguinius was not immediately visible. It did not announce itself. It did not disfigure his beauty or diminish his warmth or make him any less the radiant, gentle, ferocious being that all who knew him loved. But it was there, quiet and patient and deeply embedded, a shadow stitched into the fabric of his very genetic material, waiting with the particular, unhurried patience of something that knows it does not need to hurry. The perfection of Sanguinius was real. But it was not the whole picture. It never had been. The rise of a leader. There is a difference between being followed and being chosen. A difference between commanding obedience and inspiring loyalty. The first can be achieved through force, through fear, through the simple arithmetic of power applied to those who have none. The second is rarer, and harder, and worth incomparably more. When Sanguinius began the work of uniting the scattered and fractious tribes of Baal Secundus, he could have done it the easy way. He had the strength for it. He had the presence, the sheer overwhelming physical authority of a Primarch in his growing power, and the wasteland tribes understood strength in a way they understood very little else. A campaign of conquest would not have taken long. But that was not the path he chose. Instead, he moved between the tribes with patience and deliberateness, learning their customs and their grievances, understanding the ancient rivalries and the fresh wounds and the complicated web of obligation and enmity that bound them all together in mutual distrust. He listened more than he spoke. He offered more than he demanded. And slowly, with the particular quality of leadership that cannot be manufactured or performed but only genuinely embodied, he began to draw them together. Not into submission, but into something closer to a family. The unification of Baal's tribes was not a military campaign. It was an act of profound and sustained empathy, carried out by a being who seemed to understand, instinctively, that a people united by choice will always outlast a people united by fear. To lead well is to be many things at once, and to know, in any given moment, which of those things is needed. There are times when a leader must stand at the front of the line, weapon in hand, and demonstrate through action rather than instruction that the danger is survivable. There are other times when the most important thing a leader can do is simply be present, calm, and steady, and unafraid, so that those who are afraid can borrow from that steadiness until their own returns. Sanguinius understood both modes with an instinctive fluency that suggested he had not learned them, so much as always known them. In battle, he was extraordinary. The wasteland of Baal Secundus was not short of things that needed fighting, and Sanguinius fought them with a ferocity and a skill that left even hardened warriors struggling to find adequate words. He was at the front. Always. Not as a gesture or a performance, but because that was simply where he believed a leader belonged. And yet the warrior was only half of the picture. The other half was the figure who knelt beside the wounded, who remembered the names of children, who distributed resources with scrupulous fairness and bore the complaints and the fears of his people with undiminished patience. Warrior and savior, held in equal balance. Each made the other more credible. and together they made him, to the people of Baal Secundus, something they had perhaps never quite had before. Someone they could truly believe in. It would have been easy, perhaps even understandable, for a being of Sanguinius's capabilities to develop a certain distance from ordinary humanity. To look upon the fragile, limited, radiation-worn people of Baal Secundus and feel, however kindly, something of the separation that exists between the exceptional and the everyday. Many beings of great power, in the long history of the Imperium and beyond it, have made exactly that mistake. Have allowed the gap between what they are, and what everyone else is, to calcify into indifference, or condescension, or the well-meaning but ultimately hollow benevolence of those who help from a great height without ever truly seeing. Sanguinius never made that mistake. His compassion was not the managed strategic compassion of a leader who understands that looking after his people is good for morale. It was something rawer and more personal than that. He felt the suffering of those around him as though it were partially his own. He carried their grief with them, and their fear, and their exhaustion, and the particular bleak endurance of people who have known very little kindness and have learned not to expect it. And he gave them kindness anyway, freely and without theatre, and without any apparent awareness that it was remarkable. It was simply who he was. In a galaxy defined by coldness and scale and the grinding indifference of vast institutional power, the warmth of Sanguinius was not a small thing. It was, for many who experienced it, the most genuinely extraordinary thing about him. Reunion with the Emperor. The Great Crusade was the largest and most ambitious military undertaking in the history of humanity. Launched from Terra under the direct command of the Emperor of Mankind, it swept outward across the galaxy in great arcing waves of ships and soldiers and righteous purpose, reclaiming world after world from the darkness that had settled over them during the long and terrible centuries of the Age of Strife. It was an age of momentum and of fire, of civilizations brought back into the fold and others ground to dust, of wonders encountered and horrors faced, and the slow, grinding reassertion of human dominion over a galaxy that had very nearly forgotten what human dominion looked like. And it was during this great outward sweep that the Emperor, moving through the stars with deliberateness and intent, came at last to the Baal system. He had been searching for his sons. Each Primarch, scattered in infancy across the vast distances of the galaxy, represented both a personal loss and a strategic one, a commander without his legion, a weapon without its wielder. The reunion with Sanguinius carried all the weight that such meetings carry. Father and son, separated by the cruelty of forces neither had chosen, standing at last in the same space and taking the measure of one another. By all accounts, the Emperor looked upon Sanguinius, upon those great white wings and that luminous, sorrowful face, and felt something that went beyond satisfaction at a tactical asset recovered. He felt, it is said, something very much like pride. Every Primarch was destined, upon reunion with the Emperor, to assume command of the Space Marine Legion that had been created from his gene seed, that legion whose warriors carried within them the biological echo of their Primarch's nature, shaped by his genetics into something closer to him than any ordinary soldier could ever be. For Sanguinius, this meant the Ninth Legion. They had existed before him, as all the legions had, fighting under the Emperor's banner in the years before their Primarch was found, defined in his absence by the characteristics that his gene seed had already begun to instill in them. The Ninth Legion had a reputation, even before Sanguinius arrived, that was striking in its particularity. They were known for a ferocity in battle that bordered on the savage, and for a physical resilience that surpassed even the considerable resilience of their brother legions. But they were also known for something else, for a quality of melancholy perhaps, a brooding intensity that set them apart from the more straightforwardly martial cultures of other legions. When Sanguinius took command, he did not find strangers. He found, in the faces and the bearing and the quiet intensity of these warriors, something unmistakably familiar. The reflection of himself. And they, in turn, looked upon their Primarch, their true father, in every sense that mattered, and understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly what they were. A legion without its Primarch is an instrument without a hand to guide it. Capable, certainly, the Space Marines of the 9th Legion had proven their worth in battle many times over before Sanguinius arrived, but lacking the particular direction and character that only a Primarch could provide. From the moment he assumed command, Sanguinius began the work of reshaping his legion, not merely in tactical doctrine or organizational structure, but in spirit. He brought to them his aesthetic sensibility, his deep and genuine love of beauty, of art, of the idea that excellence in all things was not vanity but a form of honor. Under his guidance, the Blood Angels, as they would come to be known, became something that sat unusually in the wider culture of the Legiones Astartes. They were warriors of fearsome capability. Ferocious in battle, disciplined in organization, and utterly devoted to their Primarch with a loyalty that ran deeper than mere military obligation. But they were also artists, scholars, beings who understood that the cultivation of beauty and the practice of violence were not contradictions, but complementary expressions of the same underlying commitment to excellence. Sanguinius taught them that to be a Blood Angel was to aspire, always and in everything, to something finer. That the potential for greatness was not merely physical. That the soul, too, could be shaped into something worth admiring. It was a lesson that would define them for 10,000 years. Forging the Blood Angels. There is a particular kind of leadership that does not merely direct, but transforms. That takes what exists and does not simply organize it more efficiently, but fundamentally reimagines what it could become. This was the work Sanguinius undertook with the 9th Legion, and it was work that required not just authority, but vision. A clear and deeply held sense of what these warriors were capable of being, beyond what they already were. The legion he inherited was formidable. Nobody disputed that. Their ferocity in battle was the stuff of genuine legend even before their Primarch arrived, and their physical resilience made them among the most durable of all the Legiones Astartes. But ferocity without discipline is merely violence, and violence without purpose is merely destruction. Sanguinius saw in his warriors something they had not yet fully seen in themselves, a capacity for refinement, for the kind of excellence that goes beyond brute effectiveness and reaches toward something more considered and more lasting. The transformation was not overnight, and it was not without resistance, as all true transformations are not. But under his patient and passionate guidance, the savage edge of the legion was not blunted. It was directed, honed, given context and meaning. The warriors who emerged from that process were not less dangerous than the ones who had entered it. They were considerably more so, because now their ferocity served something larger than itself. It served an ideal. And an ideal, unlike mere aggression, never runs out of fuel. Every great institution understands the power of symbol. Not because symbols are merely decorative, but because they do something that words alone cannot. They compress meaning into a single image, making visible at a glance what might otherwise require paragraphs to explain. The heraldry of the Blood Angels, established under Sanguinius and carried forward through 10,000 years of war and loss and endurance, is among the most recognizable and most resonant in the entire Imperium. The winged blood drop. Simple in its geometry, profound in its layering of meaning. The blood speaks of sacrifice, of the cost that is paid, willingly and repeatedly, in the service of humanity. It speaks of the gene seed, of the biological bond that ties every Blood Angel to his brothers and to the Primarch whose nature flows in their veins. And the wings, those great sweeping wings, speak of Sanguinius himself. Of the aspiration toward something higher, something beyond the merely earthly. Together, the symbol carries within it the whole philosophy of the Legion in a form that can be painted on armor, carved into stone, pressed into the minds of those who see it on a battlefield. It says, without a single word, "We are the sons of the great angel. We bleed willingly. We rise regardless. It is a heraldry that inspires its bearers as much as it marks them, and that is precisely what the finest symbols always do. To understand why Sanguinius placed such emphasis on art and craftsmanship within his legion, it is necessary to understand what he believed art to be. Not decoration, not leisure, not the pleasant but essentially peripheral activity of those with time to spare from more important pursuits. For Sanguinius, the creation of beauty was an act of profound moral and spiritual significance. It was the most direct expression available to a conscious being, of the belief that existence is worth something, that the universe is not merely a machine, grinding through its functions, but a place in which meaning can be made, and beauty can be found, and the human spirit, even encased in the armor of a transhuman warrior, is capable of reaching toward something extraordinary. He encouraged his warriors to paint, to sculpt, to compose, to craft their armor and their weapons with the same care and intention that they brought to the practice of war. The great fortress monastery of the Blood Angels became, under his influence, not merely a military installation, but something closer to a cathedral, its walls hung with artwork of genuine quality, its corridors alive with the quiet industry of warriors who understood that the cultivation of the soul was not separate from the preparation for battle, but inseparable from it. Other legions sometimes found this puzzling. Sanguinius found their puzzlement equally so. To him, it was simply obvious. If you are fighting for humanity, you should understand what makes humanity worth fighting for. Among all the honors available within the Blood Angels Legion, one stood apart from all the rest. Not a rank in any conventional sense, not a promotion earned through seniority or administrative function, but a distinction of an entirely different kind, a recognition of something that could not be quantified or systematically assessed, but only known when it was seen. The Sanguinary Guard were the chosen warriors of Sanguinius himself. Selected not merely for their combat effectiveness, though they were among the finest warriors in a legion full of extraordinary fighters, but for something more elusive and more essential. A quality of character. A depth of honor and compassion and selfless dedication that reflected, in the eyes of their Primarch, the ideals he had spent his life embodying and trying to instill. They were his personal guard, his closest companions in battle, and they fought in golden armor that gleamed like captured sunlight, carrying weapons of exquisite craftsmanship, their very appearance a statement about what the Blood Angels believed themselves to be. But the Sanguinary Guard were more than ceremonial. They were, in a very real sense, an aspiration made visible, a reminder to every warrior in the Legion of what was possible, of the heights that could be reached by those who committed themselves fully to the ideals of their Primarch. To be chosen for the Sanguinary Guard was not merely an honor. It was a calling. And it was treated as such, with all the gravity and devotion that a calling deserves. The darkness that lived within the Blood Angels' gene seed was not something that could be wished away or ignored into non-existence. Sanguinius knew this. He had known it, in some form, since that first terrible vision on Baal Secundus, had felt in his own blood the tremor of something that was not entirely under control, something that could, under sufficient pressure, surface in ways that were dangerous and deeply troubling. The gene flaws that would eventually manifest in his legion as the Black Rage and the Red Thirst were not fully understood in his lifetime, but their early signs were visible to those who were paying attention. And Sanguinius was always paying attention. With characteristic combination of pragmatism and compassion, he set about establishing systems within the Legion to identify, monitor, and manage those warriors who showed signs of instability. Not to punish them. Not to cast them out or treat them as failures of the Legion's standards. But to care for them, to ensure that the darkness that touched them was not allowed to destroy them or those around them, while also honoring the sacrifice inherent in their condition. These early systems were imperfect, as all early systems are, and the problem they were designed to address would grow considerably more acute after his death. But they represented something important. A refusal to look away. A commitment to facing difficult truths with open eyes and a steady hand. In this, as in so much else, Sanguinius led by example. The hidden curse. There are discoveries that bring clarity, and there are discoveries that bring only the particular hollow dread of confirmed suspicion. When the Blood Angels first began to understand what the Red Thirst truly was, not merely an aberration in isolated individuals, not a rare and manageable deviation, but something systemic, woven into the very genetic fabric of every warrior who carried the gene seed of Sanguinius, it fell into the second category entirely. The Red Thirst was a hunger. Not the ordinary hunger of a body requiring sustenance, but something deeper and more disturbing, a craving that arose from the blood itself, a pull toward violence and consumption that, in its most acute manifestations, threatened to strip away everything that made a Blood Angel a disciplined and noble warrior and leave behind something altogether more savage. It surfaced differently in different warriors. In some it was a subtle thing, a sharpening of aggression in battle that required conscious management. In others it was more overwhelming, arriving with a force that tested the limits of even a transhuman will to contain. And in a small but deeply troubling number, it could not be contained at all. Sanguinius received this knowledge not with denial or despair, though both would have been understandable, but with the quiet, unflinching acknowledgement of a being who had always known, on some fundamental level, that this moment was coming. He had felt the Red Thirst himself. He understood it from the inside. And that understanding, terrible as it was, at least meant he knew what he was dealing with. What followed the discovery of the Red Thirst was one of the darkest chapters in the early history of the Blood Angels, and one of the most painful decisions Sanguinius was ever required to make. Because the Red Thirst, in its most severe manifestations, was not merely a personal affliction. It was a threat. A warrior in the grip of its worst extremes was no longer a reliable instrument of the Emperor's will. He was a danger to his brothers, to the ordinary humans he was sworn to protect, and to the Legion's ability to continue its vital work. And beyond the immediate practical danger lay a second, more institutional threat. The Imperium of the Great Crusade was not, for all its achievements, a particularly forgiving institution. The culture of the Legiones Astartes demanded strength and reliability, and the revelation that an entire legion carried within it a flaw of this nature would have consequences that were very difficult to predict and potentially devastating to manage. And so Sanguinius made a decision that cost him something real and lasting. Those warriors who had fallen fully to the Red Thirst, who could no longer be brought back from its edge by will or conditioning or the care of their brothers, were quietly, and with what dignity could be preserved, removed. It was not done with cruelty. It was done with grief. But it was done. The secret of the Red Thirst was buried alongside its most visible victims, and Sanguinius carried the weight of that burial for the rest of his life. Secrets, in the Imperium as in all closed and hierarchical institutions, have a way of traveling further than their keepers intend. The truth of the Blood Angels' affliction, that hidden darkness running through their gene seed like a fault line through rock, was known, for a time, to only a very small number of beings outside the Legion itself. But among those beings was one whose knowledge carried an enormous amount of weight. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, first among the Primarchs, the Emperor's most trusted son and the supreme commander of the Great Crusade, learned the truth of what lived in the blood of his brother's warriors. How he came to know is a matter of some historical debate. What is less debated is what he chose to do with the knowledge. He kept it, not out of compassion for Sanguinius, though their brotherhood was real and the bond between them genuine and warm, and not out of any straightforward loyalty to the Legion. Horus kept the secret because Horus was, above all things, a strategist, a being who instinctively assessed every piece of information in terms of its utility, its leverage, its potential future value. The secret of the Red Thirst was the kind of knowledge that could be deployed, filed away for a moment when it might be needed. Whether that calculation was already tinged, in those early days, by the darkness that would later consume him entirely, is a question that history cannot cleanly answer. But the secret was kept, and the keeping of it changed things in ways that would only become clear much later. A problem that cannot be eliminated must be managed. This is not a counsel of despair, it is, in its own way, a form of wisdom. The acceptance that some things cannot be wholly fixed, and that the appropriate response to such things is not surrender but the patient, disciplined construction of systems to contain them. Sanguinius, working alongside the apothecaries and senior officers of his legion, developed a program of mental conditioning intended to give every blood angel the tools to manage the pull of the red thirst without being consumed by it. It was rigorous and demanding, and built on a deep understanding of the psychological architecture of a space marine, the particular combination of transhuman biology and intensive psychological training that made them what they were, and which also, in this case, provided certain levers that could be used in the effort to maintain control. The conditioning worked, for most warriors, most of the time. It gave them a framework, a set of mental disciplines, a series of practices and focal points, that allowed them to feel the pull of the red thirst and not be swept away by it. To acknowledge the darkness without becoming it. It was not a cure. It was never intended to be a cure. It was, instead, a way of teaching warriors to live alongside something difficult without letting it define them. In this, it mirrored something of its architect's own daily practice. Sanguinius, after all, had been doing exactly the same thing since the age of 1. A brother among gods. Among the 20 Primarchs, friendships existed. Genuine ones, forged in the shared experience of impossibly demanding work and the particular intimacy of beings who understood one another in ways that nobody else quite could. But some bonds ran deeper than others, and the bonds that Sanguinius formed were notable even by the standards of that extraordinary brotherhood. With Horus, the War Master, there was something that resembled, as closely as anything in the lives of Primarchs could resemble it, genuine love. They were complementary in the way that truly close friends often are. Horus all forward momentum and decisive authority, Sanguinius all grace and reflective depth, and they balanced one another in ways that both seemed to value. Their warmth was visible and unguarded. A rarity among beings who were, by nature and necessity, accustomed to projecting strength. With Leman Russ of the Space Wolves there was a different kind of bond. Boisterous and physical, and threaded through with the particular affection that exists between people who are different enough to fascinate one another. Russ's directness and Sanguinius's refinement made for an unlikely but deeply genuine friendship. And with Jagatai Khan, the great Khan of the White Scars, there was a shared quality of spirit, a love of freedom, of movement, of the idea that excellence could be beautiful as well as functional, that drew them together across the considerable distances of their different cultures. 3 very different kinds of bond. Each one real. It is a remarkable thing, in any group of strong-willed and supremely capable individuals, for one member of that group to be genuinely respected by nearly all the others. Strong-willed individuals tend toward rivalry, toward the kind of friction that arises when multiple people of exceptional ability occupy the same space and pursue the same ultimate recognition. Among the Primarchs, this friction was not uncommon. There were rivalries and resentments and ancient grievances that simmered beneath the surface of the Brotherhood, sometimes breaking through in ways that caused real damage. And yet Sanguinius occupied a position that very few of his brothers could claim. He was respected, broadly and sincerely, across almost the full spectrum of the Primarchs. Not merely tolerated, or acknowledged as capable, but genuinely respected, admired even, by beings who did not admire easily. This was not because he was the most powerful among them, though he was formidable. It was not because he was the most obedient, or the most strategically gifted, or the most politically useful. It was because of what he was, the quality of character he brought to every interaction, the integrity that was visible in everything he did, and the simple, hard-to-define sense that in his company you were in the presence of something genuinely worth looking up to. Even those Primarchs who found his refinement puzzling, or his compassion impractical, tended to respect the consistency of it. He never pretended to be something he was not. And that, among the Primarchs, was not as common as it should have been. A gathering of 20 demigods is not, by its nature, a harmonious thing. Each Primarch was possessed of immense personal conviction, shaped by a different world and a different set of formative experiences, and carrying within him a different vision of what humanity's future should look like and how it should be achieved. The disagreements that arose from these differences were sometimes manageable. Sometimes they were not. And in those moments when the tensions between brothers threatened to become something more damaging, when pride and principle and the sheer grinding difficulty of keeping 20 extraordinary egos pointed in roughly the same direction began to generate genuine heat, Sanguinius was, more often than not, the one who stepped into the space between. He was a natural mediator. Not because he lacked strong opinions of his own, he had them, and expressed them clearly when the moment required, but because he possessed an unusual combination of qualities that mediation demands. He listened without immediately formulating his response. He was genuinely interested in understanding the other person's position, not merely in finding the flaw in it. And he carried with him a moral authority that was recognized, even by the most difficult of his brothers, as being grounded in something real. When Sanguinius spoke in those moments, people tended to hear him. Not because he was the loudest voice in the room, but because he was, so often, the clearest one. The Great Crusade was not only a military enterprise. It was, in its own turbulent and often contradictory way, an intellectual one, an attempt to remake not just the political map of the galaxy but the conceptual one, to replace the superstitions and the desperate faiths of the age of strife with something more rigorous and more sustaining. And among the Primarchs there were those for whom the philosophical dimensions of that project were as compelling as its military ones. With Magnus the Red, the great scholar-sorcerer of the Thousand Suns, Sanguinius engaged in debates of considerable depth and genuine intellectual passion. Magnus was brilliant and restless and always reaching further than caution recommended, and Sanguinius found him fascinating even when he found him troubling, which was with increasing frequency as the years of the Crusade wore on. Their debates touched on the nature of the warp, on the relationship between power and responsibility, on whether the ends of knowledge could justify the means of its acquisition. These were not idle conversations. They were the working through of real and urgent questions. With Rogel Dorn, the debates took a different character, more grounded, more focused on duty and structure and the proper relationship between a warrior and the institution he serves. Dorn's rigidity sometimes frustrated Sanguinius, who believed that principle without flexibility was just another name for brittleness. But he respected it. And Dorn, in his own reserved and careful way, respected him in return. Not every relationship among the Primarchs was warm, even where it was respectful. And there were two in particular where Sanguinius felt something beneath the surface of the brotherhood that gave him quiet, persistent unease. With Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, there was a surface similarity that perhaps made the underlying tension more acute rather than less. Fulgrim, too, pursued excellence. Fulgrim, too, prized beauty and craftsmanship and the idea that a warrior should aspire to more than mere effectiveness. But where Sanguinius's pursuit of excellence was grounded in compassion, in the service of others, in the belief that beauty was meaningful because it honored humanity, Fulgrim's began, over time, to take on a different quality. A narcissism. An obsession with perfection for its own sake, with the self as the primary object of refinement, that Sanguinius found troubling in ways he struggled to fully articulate. Something in Fulgrim's trajectory felt wrong to him, though he could not yet name what it was reaching toward. With the Thousand Suns, the tension was of a different kind, an unease about the direction of Magnus's sorceress investigations, and about what the legion's relationship with the warp might eventually cost them. Sanguinius kept these concerns largely to himself. He had learned, as all the Primarchs had to some degree, that some warnings are not heard until it is too late to act on them. The Great Crusade. The glory years. There is a distinction, in any great institution, between those who serve it and those who come to embody it. Who become, over time, not merely contributors to its mission but living symbols of what it aspires to be, figures whose presence reassures, whose reputation precedes them, and whose example sets the standard by which others measure themselves. Sanguinius, in the years of the Great Crusade's fullest flowering, had become exactly this for the Imperium of mankind. He was, in the eyes of the Emperor and in the understanding of the broader culture that was slowly coalescing around the Crusade's advance, something approaching an honor guard made flesh, a single figure who carried within him the best of what the Imperium claimed to stand for. When worlds were brought into compliance through diplomacy rather than destruction, it was often Sanguinius who was asked to lead those negotiations, his presence alone sufficient to shift the emotional tenor of an encounter. When the Emperor wished to demonstrate to some newly encountered civilization that the Imperium was more than a military machine, that it carried within it something of beauty and of genuine nobility, Sanguinius was the argument made visible. This was not a role he had sought. He had no appetite for ceremony for its own sake, and the weight of being a symbol was not one he wore lightly. But he wore it because it served a purpose. Because sometimes the thing the Imperium needed most was not another victory on a battlefield, but a reminder of what it was supposed to be fighting for. War, at the scale of the Great Crusade, required a difficult and never entirely comfortable calibration. On one side lay the absolute necessity of force. The simple, brutal reality that some resistance could not be overcome through diplomacy or demonstration, that some enemies would yield only to violence, and that hesitation in those moments cost lives in ways that could not be justified by any appeal to conscience. On the other side lay something equally important and far more easily lost in the momentum of campaign. The recognition that how a war is fought matters as much as whether it is won, and that a civilization built on the foundations of unchecked brutality would not be worth the blood spent building it. Sanguinius understood both sides of this balance with a clarity that was unusual even among the Primarchs. He was not naive about violence. He was extraordinarily capable of it, and he did not flinch from its exercise when it was genuinely necessary. But he refused, consistently and sometimes against considerable institutional pressure, to treat brutality as a default. Before a world was brought to compliance through force, he asked whether force was truly required. Before civilians were placed in harm's way, he found ways to move them out of it. Before a culture was erased in the name of imperial unity, he looked for what could be preserved. This insistence on restraint was not weakness. It was a more demanding form of strength than simple aggression, and those who served under him knew the difference. Not every great campaign in the history of the Blood Angels was defined by the supernatural. Some of the most demanding tests of the Legion's capabilities came in the form of conventional military problems of extraordinary difficulty. The kind of grinding, costly, tactically complex operations that do not generate the same mythological resonance as battles against demons or chaos-touched Primarchs, but that reveal, perhaps more clearly, the true mettle of the warriors who fight them. The campaign against the fortress world of Irra was one such test. Irra was a world that had been fortified over generations into a defensive position of formidable strength, its surface scarred with interlocking kill zones and hardened bunker networks, its defenders experienced and determined, and fighting on terrain they had spent lifetimes learning to use. A frontal assault of conventional form would have been devastatingly costly. Sanguinius did not launch a frontal assault of conventional form. Instead, He applied his tactical intelligence to the problem with the same patient thoroughness that he brought to every challenge, identifying the seams in Era's defenses not through brute force reconnaissance but through careful, methodical analysis. The campaign that followed was a masterclass in the application of the Blood Angels' particular capabilities, their speed, their ferocity, and their ability to strike where they were least expected with a precision that turned the defenders' own fortifications against them. Era fell at lower cost than any other commander would have achieved, and the lesson was noted. Among the many species encountered during the Great Crusade, few presented a challenge as unusual and as deeply unsettling as the Rud, those shadowy, entropy-wreathed creatures whose very presence accelerated the decay of everything around them. Aging flesh and corroding metal, and unraveling the ordered fabric of the material world in ways that conventional military doctrine had no prepared response to. To fight the Rud was to fight alongside the certainty of your own accelerated dissolution, to watch your brothers aged before your eyes, their armor rusting and their bodies failing in ways that had nothing to do with enemy fire and everything to do with the simple terrible fact of proximity to something fundamentally inimical to ordered existence. The cleansing operations carried out by the Blood Angels against infestations of Rud were among the most grueling in the Legion's history, requiring adaptations of both tactics and psychology that went far beyond anything the standard template of Space Marine warfare had anticipated. Sanguinius led these operations personally, accepting the personal cost of exposure in order to be present where the fighting was hardest. The psychological dimension of the Rud campaigns left marks on those who survived them that were not always visible but were always real, a particular quality of unease, a heightened awareness of mortality that sat oddly in beings who had already largely set mortality aside. Sanguinius, as always, bore his share of that burden without complaint and without evasion. There were moments in the Great Crusade when the mission of the Legiones Astartes required a different kind of courage from the courage of the assault. Not the forward momentum of attack, not the ferocious energy of the Blood Angels' favored approach to battle, but the harder and in some ways more demanding courage of the holding action, of standing between harm and those who cannot protect themselves, and refusing to move. The defense of Curate was one such moment. The civilian population of that world was caught between advancing forces that cared nothing for their survival and a strategic situation that offered no clean solution, no easy line of retreat, no tidy resolution. What it offered instead was a choice: to prioritize operational objectives, or to prioritize the people. Sanguinius made the choice without visible hesitation. The Blood Angels held at Curate. They paid for that holding in ways that were real and significant, in brothers lost, and time spent, and opportunities foregone elsewhere. But the civilians of Curate survived. And Sanguinius, when asked to account for the decision afterwards, reportedly offered no strategic justification, no cost-benefit analysis, no calculation of long-term imperial interest. He said only that they were people, and that people were what the whole enterprise was supposed to be for. It was, in its quiet way, one of the most clarifying statements he ever made. Tactical innovation. Jump pack warfare. The Blood Angels under Sanguinius were not merely inheritors of existing tactical doctrine, they were innovators, reshaping the practice of Space Marine warfare in ways that would be studied and emulated long after the Great Crusade had passed into history. The most fundamental of these innovations arose from something that was, in the Blood Angels' case, entirely natural. The combination of their Primarch's own winged mobility with the developing technology of the jump pack, which allowed warriors to launch themselves through the air with a speed and unpredictability that ground-based opponents found devastatingly difficult to counter. Under Sanguinius, jump pack warfare evolved from a supplementary tactic into a primary doctrine, a complete reimagining of how Space Marines could engage an enemy, built around the principle that altitude and momentum, properly applied, could turn the act of arrival on a battlefield into a decisive weapon in its own right. The psychological impact alone was considerable. There is something ancient and deeply unsettling in the human nervous system about attack from above, something that bypasses tactical reasoning and strikes directly at the more fundamental circuitry of fear. The Blood Angels, descending from the sky in formations of golden armor with their Primarch at their head, understood this instinctively. They were not merely fighting. They were performing something closer to a force of nature. The Angels weave. Not all of Sanguinius's tactical contributions were as immediately dramatic as the doctrine of aerial assault. Some were subtler and more intricate, and demanded from those who executed them a level of coordination and mutual awareness that most military units, even Space Marine ones, struggled to achieve. The Angels Weave was one such contribution. A complex pattern of interlocking movement and fire designed for close-quarters engagements in confined spaces, the interior of fortresses, the corridors of enemy vessels, the dense and punishing environments of urban warfare. It required its participants to operate with a degree of spatial awareness and trust in one another that went beyond the normal parameters of military teamwork. Each warrior's movement created the conditions for the next warrior's action, in a flowing, interdependent sequence that, when executed correctly, was almost impossible for an opponent to disrupt without exposing themselves to devastating counterattack from a direction they had not anticipated. The development of the Angels Weave drew on Sanguinius's aesthetic sensibility as much as his tactical intellect. There was something in its design that reflected his love of the idea that many parts, moving in concert, could create something more beautiful and more powerful than any of them could achieve alone. Those who trained in it sometimes described the experience of executing it correctly in combat as being less like fighting and more like dancing. Sanguinius, who had taught it to them, apparently considered that a satisfactory description. The Cloud of Wings. For engagements in open terrain, on the vast plains and broken landscapes where armies met in the kind of pitched battle that offered no cover and no concealment, only the raw test of force against force, Sanguinius developed a third major tactical contribution that complemented and extended the principles of his jump pack doctrine. The Cloud of Wings was a massed aerial assault formation of a particular and carefully considered design, not the concentrated spearhead of a conventional assault, but something broader and more enveloping, a formation that dispersed the attacking force across a wide front while maintaining precise coordination, creating for the enemy the experience of being descended upon simultaneously from multiple directions. The confusion this generated was its primary weapon. Against a ground-based opponent, the difficulty of tracking and responding to threats arriving from multiple aerial vectors at once was enormous, and the Blood Angels were trained to exploit that confusion with a speed that gave the enemy no time to reorganize before the next wave arrived. The Cloud of Wings was at its most devastating in combination with ground-based elements, a carefully timed coordination between those descending from the sky and those advancing across the ground that closed every axis of retreat simultaneously. It was, like all of Sanguinius's tactical thinking, built on the understanding that the best outcome of a battle was one in which the enemy's will to resist was broken before the blood toll became unbearable. Speed, confusion, and overwhelming presence. The signature of the great angel in war. The angel as a man. It is tempting, when speaking of a being of such extraordinary martial capability, to allow the warrior to eclipse the man. To reduce Sanguinius to his victories and his losses, to the campaigns won and the burdens carried, and to forget that behind all of it there was a person, a conscious, feeling, richly interior individual who had preferences and passions that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with the simple profound human need to make something beautiful. Sanguinius created. Not as a hobby, not as a distraction from more serious pursuits, but with the genuine commitment and discipline of someone who understood that art was a serious pursuit. He composed music of considerable sophistication, pieces that those who heard them described as carrying an emotional weight that was difficult to account for technically, as though the feeling in them went beyond what the notes alone could explain. He practiced calligraphy with the same patient precision he brought to the training of his warriors, finding in the discipline of the brush stroke a kind of meditation, the requirement to be entirely present, entirely focused, entirely in the moment of the mark being made. And he sculpted, working with his own hands in materials that bore the marks of those hands long after he was gone, shaping forms from stone and metal that still stand in the fortress monastery of the Blood Angels and are still regarded, by those who know such things, as works of genuine and lasting artistic merit. He made beautiful things because he believed that beautiful things mattered. It was as simple, and as profound, as that. A warrior who builds a library is making a particular kind of statement. Not about the past, but about the future. An act of faith in the idea that knowledge accumulated and preserved and made available to those who come after, has a value that outlasts any individual battle or campaign or reign. The great library of Baal was Sanguinius's most enduring architectural legacy, and its construction was driven by a conviction that ran deep in his character, that the Blood Angels were not merely warriors, but custodians. Custodians of humanity's accumulated wisdom, of the art and the scholarship and the hard-won understanding that civilizations produced in their best moments and that war so reliably destroyed. He gathered works from every world the Blood Angels encountered during the Great Crusade. Texts and artworks, and musical recordings and the documented knowledge of sciences and philosophies that might otherwise have been lost in the grinding momentum of compliance operations. He employed scholars as well as soldiers, and treated them with the same respect, understanding that the person who preserved a piece of knowledge was performing a service as essential as the person who held a defensive line. The great library grew across decades into something remarkable, a repository not just of information but of the breadth of human experience, tended by generations of Blood Angels who understood, because their Primarch had taught them to understand, that this too was part of what they were for. It stands still. Quieter now, perhaps. But it stands. There is a discipline that lies beneath all other disciplines, a practice of interior maintenance without which even the most rigorous external training eventually rings hollow. For Sanguinius, this interior discipline expressed itself in a set of personal rituals that were private and consistent, and clearly deeply important to him, even as he rarely spoke of them directly. He fasted regularly, not in the punishing self-mortifying tradition of those who use physical deprivation as a form of penance, but with a quiet intentionality, a periodic setting aside of the body's demands in order to clarify the mind's relationship with those demands. He meditated daily, and those who had reason to seek him during those hours knew to approach carefully, and to wait, because the stillness he achieved was not merely relaxation but something more concentrated, a genuine withdrawal into a place of inner quiet that he clearly needed and that he guarded accordingly. He spent time alone in reflection in ways that were unusual for a figure of his public prominence. Long periods of solitary contemplation that his closest companions learned to protect rather than interrupt. These rituals were not incidental. They were, it seems clear in retrospect, the mechanisms by which Sanguinius managed the weight of everything he carried. The visions, the knowledge of the curse in his bloodline, the responsibility of command, and the particular loneliness of being the kind of person that everyone else looks to for steadiness. He had to find that steadiness somewhere. He found it in the quiet. Among the qualities that those who knew Sanguinius returned to most consistently when speaking of him was the particular nature of his compassion, not as a general orientation or a philosophical position, but as a concrete, specific, consistently demonstrated practice. He saw individuals. Not populations, not strategic assets, not the abstract categories through which institutions so easily reduce human beings to manageable units. He saw the particular person in front of him, with their particular history and their particular struggle, and he responded to that person rather than to the category they belonged to. With civilians, the ordinary non-augmented human beings whose lives the Great Crusade was theoretically conducted in service of, his patience was without apparent limit. He remembered names. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He understood that for most people, the arrival of a Space Marine Legion was at best a disruption and at worst a catastrophe, and he took seriously the responsibility to make that encounter as humane as circumstances allowed. And with warriors who were flawed, who struggled with the gene curse, or with the psychological damage that war inflicted, or with their own failures of discipline or courage, he brought a quality of understanding that was neither indulgent nor dismissive. He did not pretend that flaws were not flaws. But he also did not reduce a warrior to their worst moment. He believed, consistently and apparently without effort, that people were more than their failures. It was, in the Imperium of mankind, a genuinely radical position. Sanguinius was a psyker of considerable power. This was not in dispute. The precognitive visions alone testified to a connection with the Imperium that went well beyond the ordinary, and there were accounts, in the records of those who fought beside him, of other abilities, moments of psychic projection, of warding, of the kind of empathic reach that could steady a panicking army simply by the directed force of his attention. He had, in short, access to capabilities that many of his brothers would have employed as primary weapons and built their entire personal fighting doctrine around. He chose not to. The reasons were characteristic of him. Partly it was caution, a deep and well-founded wariness of the warp and of the costs that accompanied any sustained reliance on its power, a wariness informed by his knowledge of what lived in his own bloodline and what the Imperium had already done to his legion. He had seen enough of what psychic power, pursued without sufficient restraint, could become. But there was something else beneath the caution, something more personal and more principled. A belief that the worth of a thing was diminished if it relied too heavily on powers beyond the ordinary. That there was a value in doing things the hard way, in meeting the demands of the world through effort and discipline rather than through the exercise of abilities that most people simply did not have. He wanted to be excellent in ways that anyone could understand. In ways that anyone could, at least in principle, aspire to. It was, in its quiet way, another form of his love for humanity. The gift and curse of foresight. To carry the future within you, uninvited and unrelenting, is not a gift in any straightforward sense of the word. It is something more ambiguous than that, a capacity that illuminates and burdens in equal measure, that provides a kind of terrible clarity at the cost of a kind of equally terrible helplessness. For Sanguinius, the visions were not occasional intrusions. They were a permanent condition, a dimension of his experience that ran alongside everything else he did, coloring his perception of the present with the weight of what he had already, in some sense, seen of the future. They came in different forms and at different intensities. Sometimes they arrived as sharp, fully realized images, vivid and specific, and devastatingly clear, like the memory of something that had already happened, rather than the premonition of something that had not yet occurred. At other times they came as something less legible, a quality of mood, a sense of impending significance, a feeling of the kind that most people dismiss as imagination but that Sanguinius had long since learned to treat with a great deal more respect. He managed these visions with a discipline that was itself extraordinary, rarely allowing them to surface visibly in his interactions with others, rarely permitting the knowledge they carried to distort his behavior in ways that would have required explanation. But the management cost him something. The effort of carrying what he knew, day after day, without allowing it to crush the warmth and the presence that those around him depended upon, that effort was immense, and largely invisible, and entirely his own. There are some pieces of knowledge so vast and so devastating in their implications that the mind recoils from them, circles them repeatedly without being able to fully absorb their meaning, unable to integrate what has been seen into any framework that makes the world feel navigable afterwards. When the visions came that showed Sanguinius the shape of what Horus would become, and what he would do, they must have carried exactly this quality. Horus, his brother, the being he had loved with a warmth and a genuineness that was rare even among the Primarchs. The War Master, the first among them, trusted above all others by the Emperor himself, placed at the summit of the entire military structure of the Imperium. The visions did not soften what they showed. They did not spare him the detail or the emotional weight of it. He saw the betrayal, not perhaps in all its specific operational particulars, but in its essential truth, in the shape of what it would mean and what it would cost. And he was required to carry this knowledge in the presence of Horus himself, to maintain the warmth of their relationship without revealing what he knew, to look at his brother and feel simultaneously the genuine love that had always been there and the grief of what that love was going to have to survive. It is difficult to imagine a more painful form of foreknowledge. To know what someone you love will do, and to be unable to stop it, and to have to go on loving them in the meantime. Beyond the betrayal of Horus, beyond the fracturing of the brotherhood he had helped to hold together, the visions showed Sanguinius something more personal and more final. He saw his own death, not as a vague premonition or a symbolic image open to multiple interpretations, but with the clarity that had always characterized his most significant visions. A clarity that left very little room for the kind of hopeful reinterpretation that most people instinctively apply to unwelcome news. He knew, with a certainty that settled into him over time and became simply part of his inner landscape, that he was going to die. That the story of Sanguinius did not end with a dignified old age or a quiet withdrawal from the stage of history. It ended in violence, at the hands of his brother, in a confrontation that the entire arc of the heresy was moving toward with the grinding inevitability of a geological process. The knowledge of one's own death is, for most conscious beings, a theoretical abstraction, something understood intellectually but held at arm's length by the merciful limitations of ordinary foresight. Sanguinius could not hold it at arm's length. He had seen it. And he had then, somehow, continued commanding, and creating, and caring for his warriors and the people under his protection, and being present and warm and fully alive in the world, right up to the moment when the vision came true. This is, perhaps, the most extraordinary thing about Sanguinius. Not the visions themselves, remarkable as they were. Not even the endurance required to carry their content through years of continued living and loving and leading. But the choice, the deliberate, considered, fully conscious choice, not to use what he knew to save himself. Because the option existed. Foreknowledge, in principle, creates the possibility of avoidance. A path foreseen is a path that can, at least in theory, be stepped off of. The event seen can be prevented, or delayed, or circumvented, if the one who holds the vision is willing to make different choices from those that lead toward it. Sanguinius was not willing. Not because he lacked the imagination to see the alternatives, but because he understood, with the same clarity that the visions themselves possessed, what those alternatives would cost. To avoid his death would be to abandon his post, to step away from the moment toward which everything was moving, the moment when the Emperor most needed every one of his sons to be exactly where they were supposed to be. He chose to go forward. He chose to face what was coming with his eyes open and his will intact, accepting the end of his own story in order to serve the larger one. This is what the Imperium means when it calls him the Great Angel. Not merely the wings, or the beauty, or the warmth. But this? The willingness to walk, knowingly, into the dark. The Horus heresy begins. There are moments in history that feel, in retrospect, like hinge points. Instants when a different choice, a different word spoken or withheld, might have turned the entire course of events onto a different track. Whether such moments are truly as decisive as they appear from the far side of their consequences is a question that historians will always debate. But the attempts of Sanguinius to warn Horus away from the path he was beginning to walk, feel in the record that survives them, exactly like this. He had seen enough in his visions, and felt enough in his interactions with his brother, to know that something was changing in Horus, something subtle enough that others had not yet fully registered it, but unmistakable to someone with Sanguinius's combination of foresight and emotional attunement. The world of Davin was a particular source of unease. The events there, the wounding of Horus, the intervention of the Serpent Lodge, the healing that was not entirely what it appeared to be, sent signals that Sanguinius could not ignore and could not fully interpret, but that left him with a cold and settled certainty that something had been done to his brother that went deeper than the physical. He approached Horus with care and with love, raising his concerns in the way that only someone who genuinely cared could. Not as accusation, but as the expression of a worry he could not in conscience keep to himself. Horus dismissed him. Warmly, persuasively, with all the considerable force of his personality applied to the task of reassurance. And Sanguinius, who loved him, allowed himself to hope that he was wrong. Before the darkness, there was the light. And the light, at its most brilliant, burned at Ullanor, the great triumph that marked the apex of the Great Crusade, the victory over the Greenskin Empire that stood as the single most significant military achievement of that extraordinary era. It was at Ullanor that the Emperor, in a gesture of trust and love and considered strategic judgment, named Horus as War Master, the supreme commander of the crusade, first among all the Primarchs, given authority that placed him only below the Emperor himself in the hierarchy of the Imperium. And it was at Ullanor that the bonds between the brothers who had fought together across decades of campaign were, for a final brilliant moment, at their most vivid and most warm. For Sanguinius and Horus, Ullanor was a kind of crystallization, a moment when everything between them was present and visible, when the long friendship and the genuine love and the complementary qualities that had always made them work so well together were on full display. They celebrated together, fought together in the final stages of the campaign, stood together in the light of a victory that felt, in that moment, like the beginning of something permanent and good. It was not the beginning of something permanent. It was the last full brightness before the long eclipse. But that is only visible now, from the distance of 10,000 years. At Ullanor, it simply felt like triumph. And for a little while at least, it was. The heresy did not begin with a single, dramatic moment of rupture. It built, as all the greatest catastrophes build, slowly and then all at once, through a long accumulation of subtle changes that were individually explainable and collectively devastating. The Brotherhood of the Primarchs, which had been the emotional and institutional backbone of the Great Crusade, did not shatter cleanly. It frayed. It developed fractures along lines of loyalty and philosophy and old grievance that had always been present but had been held in check by the forward momentum of shared purpose. As that purpose began to fragment, as rumors of Horus's changed nature spread and were dismissed and then could no longer be entirely dismissed, the relationships between the Primarchs shifted in ways that were painful and disorienting for all of them. For Sanguinius, this gradual collapse had a particular quality of grief. He had been the mediator, the warm center of so many of those relationships, the figure who helped hold the contradictions of the Brotherhood together through the force of his presence and his genuine love for his brothers. Now the thing he had helped to hold together was coming apart, and the tools he had used to hold it, empathy, patience, the quiet authority of a trusted voice, were no longer sufficient against what was being set in motion. He watched the Brotherhood dissolve with the particular anguish of someone who had seen it coming and had been unable to stop it, who had tried every approach available to him and found them all, in the end, inadequate to the scale of what was breaking. Cygnus Prime. Trial by Chaos. There is a difference between a battle and a trap. A battle is an honest exchange of violence, conducted between opponents who have both chosen the field and accepted its terms. A trap is something else entirely, a manufactured situation designed not merely to defeat an enemy but to unmake them, to reach into the architecture of what they are, and damage something that cannot easily be repaired. What awaited the Blood Angels in the Cygnus cluster was not a battle. It was a trap, laid with exquisite and malicious care by forces that had studied the legion's weaknesses with a thoroughness that suggested intimate knowledge. The Cygnus cluster had been given over entirely to the power of the blood god. Its worlds had been transformed, their population slaughtered or corrupted, their physical reality warped into something that served the purposes of chaos with the same thoroughness that a fortress serves the purposes of a defender. Every aspect of the environment had been calibrated to assault not just the bodies of the blood angels but the specific vulnerabilities of their souls, to pull at the red thirst, to amplify the stirrings of the black rage, to take the darkness that lived quietly in their gene seed and drag it screaming to the surface. By the time the full scale of what they had walked into became clear, the Legion was already embattled on every front simultaneously. Casualties mounted with a speed that had nothing to do with conventional military mathematics. Warriors who had fought across the entire Great Crusade without breaking, found themselves tested in ways they had no framework to manage. The Blood Angels very nearly ceased to exist in the Cygnus cluster. That they did not is a testament to something in them that even chaos, for all its thorough preparation, had not fully accounted for. At the heart of the nightmare that the Cygnus cluster had become, waited Karbanda. A bloodthirster of Khorne, a greater demon of war and slaughter, a being of the Imperium given terrible physical form. Karbanda was not merely a powerful opponent in the conventional military sense. It was a statement of intent. Its presence in the Cygnus cluster was a message, directed specifically at Sanguinius and his legion, from powers that had decided that the Blood Angels were worth the personal attention of something this significant. Karbanda knew what the Blood Angels were, knew the weakness that lived in them, and it had been sent to exploit that weakness to its fullest and most catastrophic extent. To break not just the Legion's bodies, but its soul. To trigger the Black Rage in enough warriors simultaneously to destroy the coherence of the force entirely. When Sanguinius faced Karbanda directly, when the two of them came together in the kind of singular defining confrontation that the scale of the battle demanded, the cost was immediate and enormous. Karbanda broke Sanguinius. Not permanently. Not finally. But in that terrible moment, the demon's assault drove the Primarch down with a force sufficient to shatter both legs, and the psychic shock of his fall rippled through the Legion with devastating effect, the psychic bond between Primarch and warriors transmitting his pain and his temporary defeat to every Blood Angel on every battlefield simultaneously. Hundreds fell to the Black Rage in that single moment. Hundreds of warriors were lost not to enemy weapons but to the darkness in their own blood, triggered by the fall of the one person whose presence had been holding it at bay. Sanguinius rose. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened at Cygnus Prime, and the thing most worth sitting with. That having been broken, having been driven down and having felt his legion shatter around him in the psychic wake of his fall, he rose. The demon had counted on the fall being the end of it. Had calculated that the Primarch's defeat would be sufficient, that the cascade of black rage spreading through the Blood Angels would finish the work that Karbanda's claws had started. The calculation was wrong. What Karbanda had not fully understood, what perhaps nothing that originated in the service of chaos could fully understand, was the particular quality of Sanguinius's will. Not the will that came from pride, or from the refusal to accept defeat, or from the combative stubbornness that characterized so many of his brothers. But the will that came from love. From the knowledge of his warriors broken around him, from the sight of what had been done to the legion he had built and shaped and cared for across decades of campaign. He rose for them. And in rising, he turned the battle. Karbanda was defeated, driven back, its physical form banished from the Imperium, the demonic assault broken by the force of a Primarch who had been given every reason to stay down and had chosen otherwise. The victory was real. But it was purchased at a price that the Blood Angels would be paying for 10,000 years. What was done to the Blood Angels in the Cygnus cluster was not merely damage of the conventional kind. It was not only the warriors lost in battle, or the psychological scars carried home by those who survived, or the physical toll of a campaign conducted in conditions of almost supernatural hostility. What was done there was deeper than any of that, and more lasting, and in some ways more cruel. The deliberate assault on the Legion's gene floor, the sustained targeted effort to pull the Black Rage to the surface, to force the Red Thirst past the conditioning that had been built to contain it, to weaponize against the Blood Angels the very thing that Sanguinius had spent his life trying to manage and protect his warriors from, left a mark in their genetic material that did not fade when the battle was over. Something had been aggravated in the Cygnus cluster that could not be fully soothed back into its previous state. The curse that had always lived in the Blood Angel's blood was after Cygnus Prime, a little closer to the surface. A little harder to hold back. The conditioning that had worked so reliably before required more effort to maintain. The visions of the Black Rage came more frequently, and more vividly, to more warriors. It was as though chaos, having been denied the clean destruction of the Legion, had settled instead for something subtler and in its own way more devastating. A slow deterioration. A gradual deepening of the wound that would express itself most fully, not in the Blood Angels who had fought at Cygnus Prime, but in their successors, across all the long dark millennia to come. The road to terror. There is a particular kind of courage that receives very little recognition, because it is not visible in the way that the courage of the charge or the last stand is visible. It does not announce itself. It does not generate the kind of moment that can be painted or sung about or recounted around a fire with the satisfying shape of a story that has a clear beginning and middle and end. It is the courage of continuation, of getting up in the morning and doing the work, and being present for the people who need you to be present, when you know, with a certainty that cannot be argued with or reasoned away, that it is all moving toward an ending you cannot prevent. After Cygnus Prime, as the heresy spread and the shape of what was coming resolved itself with increasing clarity out of the fog of rumor and report, Sanguinius continued. He organized. He commanded. He fought on a dozen fronts across the splintering Imperium, applying his tactical intelligence and the formidable capabilities of his legion to the preservation of what could be preserved, the holding of what could be held. He attended to his warriors with the same care he had always brought to them, learning their names and their struggles, bearing their burdens alongside his own. He created still. There are works attributed to the final years of his life that carry in them a quality of feeling that those who study them find almost unbearable to sit with for long, as though the knowledge of what he was carrying leaked through despite every effort to contain it. He did not slow down. He did not withdraw. He did not spend what remained of his time preparing for his own ending. He spent it in service. Right up to the last. When the scale of the heresy became undeniable, when it was clear that the War Master's forces were not a regional threat to be contained and turned back, but a tide moving inexorably toward the heart of the Imperium itself, the question of terror's defense became the most urgent strategic problem in human history. Everything narrowed to that point. The fortress world that humanity had built around the seat of the Emperor's power, the walls and bastions, and void shields and overlapping fields of fire, that Rogel Dorn had spent years constructing and refining, all of it would be tested, and tested by forces of a scale and ferocity that had never before been directed against a single target. Dorn was already there, already working, already driving the defensive preparations with the relentless and systematic thoroughness that was his defining characteristic. And Sanguinius came to stand beside him. It was, in some ways, an unlikely pairing. Dorn's rigidity and Sanguinius's fluidity had always created a certain tension between them, a philosophical friction born of genuinely different orientations toward the same fundamental questions of duty and principle. But the Siege of Terror was not the moment for philosophical friction. It was the moment for two brothers who trusted each other to work together with everything they had, and that is what they did. Sanguinius brought to the defensive preparations the same combination of tactical creativity and sustained compassion that defined everything he did. Finding the angles that Dorn's more systematic thinking had not covered, and doing it without ego and without competition, because there was no room left in the world for either. In the final approach to the Siege of Terra, as the traitor forces gathered in numbers that were by any rational military assessment overwhelming, and as the remaining loyalist primarchs and their legions drew together in the knowledge that what was coming would test them beyond any previous limit. In those dark and narrowing days, the presence of Sanguinius carried a weight that went far beyond his practical military contribution, significant as that was. He had become, across the years of the heresy, something that the Imperium desperately needed and found increasingly difficult to locate. Not just a capable commander, not just a powerful warrior, but a reason, a visible, living, breathing argument for why any of it was worth the cost. Because Sanguinius, even then, even carrying everything he carried, knowing everything he knew, having endured Cygnus Prime and the collapse of the Brotherhood and the long grinding grief of watching the Imperium that the Great Crusade had built begin to tear itself apart, even then, he was warm. He was present. He moved through the defenders of Terra and spoke to them and looked at them, and made each of them feel, for a moment, that they were seen and valued and that the thing they were being asked to die for was worth dying for. This is not a small thing. In the mathematics of a siege, the will of the defenders matters as much as the thickness of the walls. And wherever Sanguinius went, the will of the defenders was stronger for it. He was hope, made incarnate. And hope, at the walls of Terra, was worth more than almost anything else. Siege of Terra. The final war. When the Warmaster's fleet broke through the outer defenses and the Siege of Terra began in earnest, the nature of what the defenders faced became clear with a speed and a totality that left no room for the comfortable distance of strategic abstraction. This was not merely a war between armies. The forces Horus had brought to the walls of Terra were not simply soldiers of the traitor legions, formidable and terrible as those were. They were accompanied by something worse, by the demonic hosts of the Chaos Powers, creatures of the Imperium given physical form by the thinning of the boundary between reality and the warp that the scale and intensity of the conflict was producing. They poured through breaches in the materium as through wounds in the fabric of the world itself, and against them the conventional calculus of military defense was of limited use. Against them, what mattered most was not walls or weapons or even tactical brilliance, but the ability to stand in the presence of something fundamentally terrifying and not break. Sanguinius stood at the front. Not as a figure of inspiration positioned carefully for maximum symbolic effect, but as a combatant. Fully, physically, ferociously present on the most contested ground, where the demonic tide pressed hardest and where the defenders needed most urgently to see that it could be resisted. He fought with everything he had, with the full measure of his extraordinary capability directed without reservation at the task of holding the line. Against demons, he was devastating. Against the darkness that poured through the breaches in the walls of Terra, the great angel stood, and the darkness, at least for a time, did not pass. A city under siege is not merely a military problem. It is a psychological one. The defenders of Terra, the space marines of the loyalist legions, the mortal soldiers of the imperial army, the ordinary men and women who had been pressed into the defense of walls they had never expected to stand on, were being asked to endure something that the history of human warfare had very rarely demanded of anyone. Not just to fight, but to fight in the knowledge that the enemy was vast and that relief was uncertain and that every hour of resistance was purchased at a cost that compounded without mercy. In those conditions, the human spirit does what it has always done under unbearable pressure. It looks for something to hold on to. Something that makes the endurance feel possible. Something that says, without requiring words, that the thing being defended is worth defending and that the people doing the defending are not alone. Sanguinius was that something. for thousands of defenders across the breadth of the beleaguered planet. Reports from the siege speak of his presence at crisis points across the theater of battle. Not teleporting, not moving with the assistance of any ability that removed the human element from his arrival, but flying. Those wings carrying him from wall to wall, from breach to breach, visible against the smoke-choked sky of dying terror to everyone who looked up. And everyone looked up. Because there was something in the sight of him, in the specific image of those white wings against the darkness, that reached past the rational and touched something older and more fundamental. Something that said, "We are not alone." Something that said, "Hold." To speak of Sanguinius at the Siege of Terra is to speak of sacrifice in its most complete and most costly form. Not the sacrifice of a moment, the single dramatic gesture that costs everything in an instant and is then over. But the sacrifice of sustained presence. Of choosing, day after day, to pour everything you have into the service of others, knowing that the reservoir is not infinite, knowing that what you are spending cannot be replenished, knowing that every hour of effort is an hour closer to an end that you have already seen and accepted. He did not spare himself at the Siege of Terra. He spent himself freely, and with a kind of deliberate generosity that those who witnessed it found almost impossible to fully comprehend. He took wounds that would have killed ordinary space marines and continued fighting. He absorbed the psychological weight of what was happening around him, the deaths of warriors he had known for decades, the suffering of the mortal defenders, the grinding relentless pressure of a siege that showed no signs of breaking, and he continued to project the warmth and the steadiness that others needed from him, because he understood that his own grief was a private matter and that the needs of those around him were not. This is the thing that the title of Great Angel truly honors. Not the wings, not the beauty, not even the extraordinary martial capability. But this, the willingness to give everything, completely and without reservation, in the service of something larger than yourself. At the Siege of Terra, Sanguinius did not merely fight. He gave. And what he gave without counting the cost. The final confrontation. There comes a point in every great story where the path narrows to a single thread, where all the choices made and all the roads taken converge on one door, and the only thing that remains is whether the person standing before it has the courage to open it. For Sanguinius, that door was the vengeful spirit, the flagship of the War Master, the vessel that had carried Horus across the galaxy at the head of his great and terrible rebellion, that had become in the popular imagination of both sides of the conflict a symbol of everything the heresy represented, the betrayal of brotherhood, the corruption of greatness, the terrible proof that even the finest can fall. To board it was to enter the heart of the darkness. And Sanguinius boarded it. Alone, or near enough to alone that the distinction made little practical difference in what followed. He did not go as part of a coordinated assault. He did not wait for optimal conditions or strategic advantage or the kind of carefully prepared approach that military doctrine would have recommended. He went because the moment had arrived, and because everything he was, and everything he believed, pointed in one direction only. Forward, through the door, into whatever waited on the other side. He had seen this moment in his visions. He knew what the vengeful spirit contained. He knew what it would cost him to enter it. He stepped aboard anyway, because that was who he was, and because who he was had never once been altered by the knowledge of what it would cost. The details of what passed between Sanguinius and Horus aboard the vengeful spirit before the Emperor's arrival are preserved imperfectly, filtered through the accounts of those who were not present and the fragmentary psychic impressions gathered in the aftermath. But the essential truth of it is not in dispute. They faced each other, the two brothers who had been closer than most, who had stood together at Ullanor in the full light of triumph and whose bond had been, for a time, one of the most genuine and most warm in the entire history of the Primarchs. And the being that Sanguinius found in that confrontation was not entirely Horus. Not the Horus of those years of brotherhood and shared purpose and the kind of love that exists between people who truly see one another. that Horus was still present, perhaps. Buried under everything that had been done to him, visible in flickers through the surface of what he had become, like a face glimpsed through deep and murky water. But the thing in command of the body of the War Master was something that had used the vessel of Horus's greatness as a vehicle for its own purposes, and what it wanted from this confrontation was not resolution or closure or the honest reckoning between brothers that the moment superficially resembled. What it wanted was either the corruption of Sanguinius or his death. And Sanguinius, standing in the presence of his brother's ruin, understood this with a clarity that the grief of the moment did not diminish. Horus offered him a choice. This is the part of the account that carries perhaps the most weight, and that has been returned to and examined and debated in the theological literature of the Blood Angels and the broader Imperium for 10,000 years. He was offered the chance to join. Not merely to surrender, not merely to stand aside, but to take the power that chaos was prepared to offer and use it, to become something vast and terrible and immune to the ending that waited for him if he refused. The temptation was real. It was crafted with the thorough knowledge of everything Sanguinius cared about, everything he had always wanted and had always held himself back from reaching for. Power sufficient to protect his legion from the curse that lived in their blood. Power sufficient to turn the tide of the heresy and impose a different outcome on a war that was, by any objective assessment, going very badly for the side he had chosen. The offer was not made by a stranger. It was made by his brother, or by what wore his brother's face, and it carried within it the weight of everything they had been to each other. Sanguinius refused. Not with anguish, not with visible struggle, not with the dramatic torment of a being genuinely uncertain of its own answer. He refused with a clarity and a stillness that suggested the question had, in some sense, already been settled, long before he stepped aboard the vengeful spirit. The answer had always been no. Not because the temptation was not real, but because he knew, with absolute certainty, what accepting it would mean. And what it would mean was the betrayal of every person he had ever loved. What Sanguinius said in those final moments, in the space between the refusal and what followed from it, has been recorded in fragmentary forms, each version slightly different, none of them claiming to be a precise transcript of words spoken in conditions that did not lend themselves to careful documentation. But across all the versions, the essential declaration is consistent. He spoke for humanity. Not for the Emperor, though his loyalty to the Emperor was real and unbroken. Not for the Imperium as an institution, with all its flaws and all its machinery and all the ways it fell short of what it was supposed to be. But for the people, the ordinary, fragile, endlessly suffering and endlessly resilient human beings whose existence was the whole point of everything, whose potential was the thing the Emperor had always claimed to be serving and that Sanguinius had always, in his own way, genuinely believed in. He had spent his entire life in their service. He had built a library for them, and created art for them, and held the line for them, and carried his curse for them, and walked knowingly into this confrontation for them. And in those last moments, he said so. Not with grandeur. Not with the rhetorical flourish of someone composing a statement for posterity. But simply, and clearly, and with the full weight of a life lived entirely in accordance with those words behind them. He was loyal. He had always been loyal. And he remained so, right to the very end. The death of an angel. He died. This is the fact at the center of everything. The hard, irreducible truth around which all the beauty and all the tragedy and all the 10,000 years of mourning and myth-making ultimately orbit. Sanguinius, the great angel, the brightest one, the most beloved of the Primarchs, was killed by his brother, by Horus, by the being that had once been the finest of the Emperor's sons and that had become, through corruption and choice and the long terrible working of chaos upon a soul that had once been genuinely great, something that wore that greatness as a mask over an abyss. The manner of it matters, and has always mattered to those who carry his memory. He was not taken by surprise. He was not overwhelmed before he could act, or brought low by some trick or ambush that denied him the chance to face what was coming. He had known it was coming after all, and he had come aboard the vengeful spirit with his eyes fully open. He fought. Of course he fought, because that was what he was, and because to do otherwise would have been a kind of betrayal of the warriors he had shaped and the people he had spent his life defending. He wounded Horus. The accounts are consistent on this point, and it matters, not merely as a detail of military record, but as a statement about who Sanguinius was. Even at the end, facing a being of power that exceeded his own, corrupted and armored and sustained by the full force of Chaos's investment in its chosen champion, Sanguinius left his mark. He fell, but he did not fall without answering. And the answer he gave, in those last moments, changed everything that followed. Death, for most beings, is a private and localized event. It happens in one place, and its reverberations extend outward only as far as the reach of those who cared for the one who died, through grief, through absence, through the quiet devastation of the space that a person leaves behind them. But Sanguinius was not most beings. He was a Primarch, a being of immense psychic presence, whose connection to the Imperium was deep and whose bond with the warriors who carried his gene seed was not merely institutional or emotional but biological and psychic in ways that had no ordinary parallel. When he died, the galaxy felt it. The death cry of Sanguinius, the involuntary psychic emanation released in the moment of his ending, tore through the warp and the materium alike with a force that was felt across impossible distances. Every blood angel fighting at that moment, wherever they were, in the vast and burning theater of the heresy, felt something happen to them that they could not name but could not mistake. A rupture. A tearing away of something that had been present in them always, that they had not known was there until the moment it was gone. Some fell to the black rage in that instant. Some wept without knowing why, in the middle of battles that left no room for weeping. Some simply felt the world become, in some fundamental and irreversible way, a darker place than it had been the moment before, as though a light that had been burning at the center of everything had gone out, and the going out of it had cast shadows into corners that had never been shadowed before. And yet, even in dying, even in the absolute final act of a life that had been oriented from its very first breath toward the service of others, Sanguinius gave one last gift. The wounds he had dealt to Horus in their confrontation were not merely physical, though the physical damage was real and significant. They were something more. The armor of Horus, the great and terrible warplate that the power of Chaos had rendered all but impervious, that had turned aside weapons and abilities that should by any reasonable assessment have been sufficient to end the Warmaster's life, had been breached. The precise mechanism by which this was achieved is a matter of ongoing theological debate within the institutions of the Imperium, and the accounts that survive are not sufficiently technical to resolve it cleanly. What is not debated is the effect. When the Emperor arrived, when the confrontation between father and corrupted son that was always the true fulcrum of the entire heresy finally took place, the damage that Sanguinius had done was there. A crack in the armor. A wound in the defenses. A vulnerability in something that had been, before Sanguinius reached it, invulnerable. The Emperor won that confrontation at enormous personal cost, a cost that would define the next 10,000 years of human history. But the margin by which he won it, the narrow, terrible, almost insufficient margin, was purchased in part by the blood of Sanguinius. He gave everything in that confrontation aboard the vengeful spirit. And everything, it turned out, was exactly enough. The curse unleashed. There are wounds that do not bleed immediately, that hold their damage in suspension for a moment, for an hour, or a day, or the span of a great battle, before the full weight of what has been done makes itself known. The death of Sanguinius was such a wound for the Blood Angels, and its full consequence did not announce itself all at once, but unfolded, across the days and weeks and months after his passing, with the slow and awful thoroughness of something that had been waiting a very long time to be released. The Black Rage and the Red Thirst had always existed in the Blood Angel's genetic material, seeds of darkness planted by the particular character of Sanguinius's gene seed, and deepened by what had been done to the Legion at Cygnus Prime. They had been managed, contained, held at a level that allowed the Legion to function and fight and maintain its identity as something more than the sum of its afflictions. That management had been possible, in large part, because of him. Because the psychic presence of Sanguinius had served as a kind of anchor, not consciously maintained, not a deliberate act of psychic suppression, but a natural consequence of what he was, and how deeply he was woven into the being of every warrior who carried his gene seed. When that anchor was removed, the darkness that it had been holding rose. The Black Rage, which had previously taken warriors in ones and twos and been manageable within the system Sanguinius had established, became something broader and more consuming, a tide rather than a trickle, capable of overwhelming warriors who had previously shown no signs of susceptibility. And the Red Thirst deepened in concert with it, the hunger sharpening and intensifying into something that required a vigilance that had not previously been necessary. The curse had been unleashed. Not by any single dramatic event, but by the simple devastating absence of the one person whose presence had always made it bearable. The scarring that the death of Sanguinius left on his legion was not temporary. It was not the kind of damage that time heals, or that new leadership and renewed purpose, and the slow careful work of rebuilding can fully repair. It was constitutional, woven into the genetic fabric of every blood angel and every warrior who would ever be made from the gene seed that Sanguinius had left behind, expressing itself differently in different individuals but present, always, in all of them. The blood angels became, in the aftermath of the heresy, a legion defined in part by their loss, in a way that went beyond the mourning that all the loyalist legions carried for the years of the war and the brothers who had not survived them. Other legions had lost warriors, had lost primarchs, had lost campaigns and certainties and the comfortable sense of a universe moving in a comprehensible direction. The Blood Angels had lost something additional and more intimate, something that lived inside them, in the blood and the bone, and the deepest architecture of what they were. Every warrior who fell to the Black Rage was in a sense falling to the same wound. Every warrior who fought to hold back the Red Thirst was fighting a battle that Sanguinius had once, by his existence, made easier. They wore these facts as they wore their armor, not with resentment, not with despair, but with the particular quality of pride that comes from carrying something difficult without being crushed by it. Scarred, yes. Diminished, never. The Blood Angels understood, perhaps better than any other institution in the Imperium, the difference between a wound and a defeat. There is a theological concept within the Blood Angels and their successor chapters that has been debated and refined across 10,000 years of scholarship and lived experience. The idea of the death vision. The belief that in the deepest grip of the Black Rage, when the boundary between a warrior's present self and the psychic imprint of his Primarch becomes thin enough to dissolve, what the afflicted Blood Angel experiences is not merely a hallucination or a breakdown of rational function, but something more profound and more specific. He experiences the death of Sanguinius. Relives it, in the first person, with a fidelity and an emotional intensity that makes the distinction between memory and experience meaningless. He is Sanguinius, in those moments, standing on the vengeful spirit, facing Horus, feeling the full weight of that confrontation from the inside. This is what the Black Rage truly is, in its deepest expression. Not madness. Or not only madness, but a bond. An involuntary, perpetual, agonizing bond between every Blood Angel who has ever lived, and the moment of their Primarch's death. They are bound to his fate in the most literal sense available. They carry it in them always, and for some of them it rises up and claims them entirely, drawing them out of their own present and into his past, over and over, without resolution. It is the most extraordinary form of grief in the Imperium of mankind. It is also, in its own terrible way, the most extraordinary form of loyalty. They are with him still, in those moments. And he, perhaps, is with them. Legacy. The Eternal Angel. 10,000 years is a long time for a legend to endure without becoming something else entirely, without being smoothed and simplified and hollowed out by the repeated handling of generations until what remains is more monument than memory. And yet the legend of Sanguinius has not followed that pattern. It has not faded or flattened or become the kind of comfortable distant myth that can be admired without being felt. It has remained vivid, and strange, and alive in ways that resist easy explanation. Part of the reason for this is the Sanguinor. A being of uncertain origin and deeply contested theological status, the Sanguinor appears in the records of the Blood Angels and their successors with a frequency and a consistency that makes dismissal difficult. It manifests in times of the Legion's greatest need, a golden figure of immense power, armored in the image of the Sanguinary Guard, fighting with a ferocity and a grace that witnesses have always struggled to distinguish from the accounts of Sanguinius himself in battle. It does not speak. It does not explain itself. It arrives, and fights, and departs, leaving behind it a silence in which the question it poses hangs unanswered. Is it a remnant of Sanguinius, some fragment of his psychic presence preserved in the warp by the force of what he was and the intensity of his death? Is it a separate being, created or shaped by the accumulated faith of those who have mourned him? Is it something else entirely, operating according to logic that the institutions of the Imperium do not yet have adequate categories to describe? The answer, after 10,000 years, remains genuinely open. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Some mysteries are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to be lived with. Every great figure leaves behind them, in the hands of those who loved them, objects. Physical things that the grief of the living invests with meaning beyond their material nature, not because the objects themselves possess power, but because they were touched by the person who is gone, and touching them is the closest thing to closeness that remains. For Sanguinius, this impulse has expressed itself across 10,000 years in the preservation and veneration of relics that have become some of the most sacred objects in the entire Imperium. The Red Grail stands at the center of this constellation of sacred objects, a vessel said to have been used to collect the blood of Sanguinius himself, maintained by the sanguinary priests and used in rituals whose theological significance to the Blood Angels is difficult to overstate. To drink from the Red Grail is to participate in something that the Blood Angels understand as a form of communion with their Primarch, an act of physical connection across the vast distance of death, a bridge built of blood between the living and the irretrievably lost. Fragments of his armor, carefully preserved and exhaustively authenticated, are distributed among the Blood Angels and their successor chapters as objects of veneration. And the tear relics, crystallized tears attributed to Sanguinius himself, gathered in the moments of his deepest grief and preserved with a care that speaks to how profoundly those who gathered them understood what they were preserving, are among the most intimate of all the sacred objects associated with him. They say something that armor and weapons cannot. They say that he felt everything. And that the feeling of it for him was real. Ritual is how communities hold together the things they cannot afford to lose. How they take what is too large and too important to be contained in any individual memory and distribute it across the shared practice of a group, ensuring that even as individuals come and go, the essential thing persists, carried not in any single mind but in the actions performed together, the words spoken in unison, the gestures repeated across generations until they become second nature. And then something deeper than second nature. The sanguinary rite is the most significant of the rituals by which the Blood Angels and their successors maintain their connection to Sanguinius across the millennia. Its precise form varies somewhat between chapters. The successors each carry their own inflections and emphases, shaped by 10,000 years of divergent history and individual character, but its essential structure is consistent. It is a rite of remembrance and of renewal, of the explicit acknowledgement of what was lost and the equally explicit commitment to carrying forward what he stood for. The sanguinary priests who conduct it do so with a gravity and a care that reflects the weight of what is being handled, not merely a ceremony, but an act of psychic and spiritual maintenance, a deliberate and communal tending of the connection between the living and the dead. Those who undergo it do not emerge from it unchanged. It asks something real of them. And what it asks is, in the end, the same thing Sanguinius always asked of those around him: to be, in whatever measure they could manage, worthy of what they carried. The influence of Sanguinius does not stop at the walls of the Blood Angels' fortress monastery, or at the boundaries of the chapters that carry his gene seed. It extends outward, diffuse, and persistent, into the broader culture of the Imperium in ways that are sometimes difficult to trace directly but are unmistakable in their cumulative effect. His image appears in the iconography of worlds that have no formal connection to his legion, in the winged figures carved above the doors of shrines, in the angelic forms that populate the devotional art of the imperial cult, in the prayer book illustrations that billions of ordinary human beings handle daily without necessarily knowing whose wings they are looking at. The archetype he represents, the beautiful, tragic, sacrificial figure who gives everything for those who cannot protect themselves, has become woven into the spiritual fabric of the Imperium at a level that goes beyond any deliberate program of veneration. People reach for his image instinctively, because the thing he embodies answers something instinctive in the human need for meaning. The idea that nobility is real. That sacrifice can be beautiful rather than merely terrible. That the universe, for all its darkness and its scale and its grinding indifference, contains within it the possibility of something genuinely worth loving. He has become, 10,000 years after his death, one of the Imperium's most powerful arguments for its own worthiness. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because that is simply, quietly, what he was. Once a year, across every Blood Angel's successor chapter and in many of the broader institutions of the Imperium that have developed their own relationship with his memory, the death of Sanguinius is formally marked. The Day of Remembrance, known by different names in different chapters and different cultures, observed with different specific practices but with a consistency of intent that speaks to how deeply the need for it is felt, is not a celebration. It is not the triumphant commemoration of a victory, in the manner that many imperial observances are structured. It is something more honest than that, and in its honesty, more sustaining. It is a mourning. A formal, communal, held-together grief for something that was lost and that has not been replaced and that the passage of 10,000 years has not made any less real. Warriors who have known nothing but war, sit in silence and remember a figure they never met. Sanguinary priests speak words that have been spoken in the same form for generations. The relics are brought out and handled with the care that irreplaceable things deserve. And somewhere in the practice of all of it, in the sitting together in the knowledge of the loss, in the choosing to feel it rather than to paper over it, there is something that functions as healing, even if it never quite reaches completion. He is mourned because he mattered. And the mattering does not diminish with time. It is, if anything, the most enduring thing about him. The word hero is used easily, and often, and in its easy usage it loses something of its true weight. It becomes a label applied to competence, or to courage in a single moment, or to the simple fact of having been present at something significant and having come through it. But the oldest understanding of the word carries more than this, a meaning inherited from the myths that humanity told itself in its earliest centuries, when stories were the primary technology for making sense of a world that did not explain itself. In those oldest stories, the hero is not simply the one who wins, or the one who is strongest, or the one who survives. The hero is the one who is chosen by fate for a task that will cost them everything, and who accepts the choosing. Who walks toward the thing that will destroy them, not in ignorance, not in the comfortable numbness of someone who does not understand what is coming, but in full and clear-eyed knowledge, carrying that knowledge with grace, and continuing anyway. By this understanding, which is the truest understanding, Sanguinius was not merely a hero. He was perhaps the purest expression of what the word has always meant, that the long history of the Imperium has produced. He was given every gift that could be given to a living being, and every gift came with a corresponding burden. He was shown the future, and the future was not kind. He was given brothers, and the brothers broke. He was given a legion, and the legion carried within it a darkness he could contain but never cure. He bore all of it, the gifts and the burdens together, without separating them, without pretending the darkness was not there or that the gifts absolved him of the responsibility to face it. He was, in the fullest and most ancient sense of the word, a tragic hero. And the tragedy of him is inseparable from the greatness of him. You cannot have one without the other. The wound is part of the wonder. He was a being who knew his fate, and chose it anyway. Let us sit with this for a moment, because it deserves the sitting. He knew. This is the thing that separates the story of Sanguinius from every other story of heroism and sacrifice in the vast archive of imperial history, the thing that gives it a weight and a quality that does not diminish with repetition or familiarity. He knew what was coming. Not as a suspicion, not as a fear held at arm's length by the merciful uncertainty that protects most conscious beings from the full weight of their own mortality. He knew with the clarity of a vision that had come to him in childhood and returned to him across decades, refining itself each time into something more specific and more undeniable, until what had begun as a terrible impression had become something indistinguishable from memory. He had seen his death. He had seen his brother's face above him, and felt the ending coming, and carried that knowledge through every subsequent year of his life, through the Great Crusade and the forging of his legion and the building of his library and the long warm work of caring for the people in his charge. He had carried it through Cygnus Prime and through the collapse of the Brotherhood and through the grinding horror of the heresy. He had carried it to the walls of terror and through the breach of the vengeful spirit and into the confrontation that his visions had always pointed toward. And at every point along that road, the choice to turn aside had been available to him. A different decision here, a different direction there, and the ending the vision showed him need not have been the ending that occurred. He chose not to turn aside. He chose to walk the road all the way to its end, because he understood that the road was not about him. It had never been about him. It was about the people who needed someone to walk it so that they did not have to. He chose his fate. And in choosing it, he transformed it from something done to him into something done by him, an act of will, so complete and so deliberate that it became, in the end, the truest expression of everything he had always been. And so we return, at the end, to where we began. To a being of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary sorrow, whose wings caught the light of 100 burning worlds and whose hands were equally capable of creating something lovely and of ending something terrible. To the most beloved of the Emperor's sons, who loved in return with a depth and a consistency that never wavered, not once, across a life that gave him every reason to close himself off from the cost of it. He fell. We know this. We have always known this. The fall of Sanguinius is not a secret or a tragedy to be broken gently, it is the central fact of his story, the thing that his name has always carried with it, the shadow that has followed his image across 10,000 years of mourning and remembrance. He fell, and the galaxy was darker for it, and the blood angels carry that darkness in their blood to this day, and the wound of his absence has never fully healed in the institutions and the culture and the quiet devotional life of the billions who have found, in his image, something worth believing in. But the falling is not the whole of it. It is not even the most important part. The most important part is what the falling made possible. The Emperor reached the War Master. The heresy was broken. Humanity endured, battered and diminished, and scarred in ways that would define the next 10,000 years, but enduring. Still here. Still fighting. Still, in its most lucid moments, still capable of producing something that resembles what Sanguinius always believed it could be. He fell so that it could. He walked into the dark, knowingly and willingly, so that somewhere behind him a light could remain. This is who he was. This is what he chose. And this is why, 10,000 years later, in the quiet moments before sleep, when the noise of the world has faded and there is space for something older and more essential to be heard, this is why his name still means something. Why the wings still catch the light in 10,000 pieces of art across 10,000 worlds. Why the grief is still real, and the love behind the grief is still real, and the thing he gave everything for is still, against all the odds, worth giving everything for. Rest now. For the angel watches still.